IELTS examiners see the same mistakes over and over again in Task 1 writing. And what's most frustrating for them is they can see that if you made just a few simple changes, you could have got a Band 7, 8, or even 9. The difference between Band 6 and Band 8 isn't about English level or intelligence. It's about understanding exactly what the examiner wants to see. So in this video, I'll show you a real Band 6 report and transform it step by step into a Band 8 report, explaining exactly why each change works so that you can copy it and use it in your own writing. So the first thing we're going to do is look at this Band 6 report and tell you why it is at a Band 6. It's really important that you not only understand what to do well, but how to avoid the key mistakes that Band 5, Band 6 students make too. So let's look at the difference for task achievement for Band 6 and Band 8. So for Band 6, it states presents overview with information appropriately selected. So it is directly mentioning the overview. The overview is the most important paragraph in the entire report. It's the only paragraph that they specifically mention in the marking criteria. So that should tell you just how important it is. And I can tell you that's the first thing that most examiners look at when they look at your Task 1 report. And within an overview, you're going to have key features. These are the most important things from the data. And it says key features may be irrelevant, inappropriate, or inaccurate. So what it's saying there for Band 6 is you do have an overview and you are including some key things, but they might be inaccurate, they might be unclear, or they might be confusing. So just writing an overview isn't enough. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be clear. So we need to focus in on the data. When you're writing an overview, the key thing you need to be thinking is, what is the purpose of the data? In other words, why did the person create this chart? So when we look at it, we can see that it is doing two things. When we see a line graph over time, it is showing the general trends over that time frame. So we're looking at what is generally happening between 2008 and 2022. Because the key here is this is the purpose of the chart, to show the general trends from 2008 to 2022. I take a look at the chart now and think about the other key reason. So did you spot it? To compare the different countries. So if all we did was just look at that chart and think, what is the main purpose or purposes behind this, we can then easily write our overview. So let's look at our Band 6 student and think about, did they actually think about the purpose and did they clearly state the correct things? So overall, all kingdoms in the EU. So straight away, the student has made two key mistakes. Number one, they're trying to use too many synonyms for the word country, and they've included the word kingdom. Kingdom and country are synonyms. If you look in a thesaurus, you will see them next to each other, but they don't mean the same thing. They're not close synonyms. So it is actually inaccurate to use that. And the second mistake that they have made using their own knowledge is they have assumed that all of these countries are in the EU, and they are not. For a Task 1 report, you should never bring in your own knowledge because it's often wrong. You should base your answer only on what it says in the actual data. So the actual data doesn't talk about the EU. So by saying all these countries are in the EU, you are bringing your own data and putting it into the data source, which is just going to be wrong. This is very important because, as we said before, the examiner is thinking about accuracy. Did you take the data and put it on the paper accurately? So if you are writing about all these countries are in the EU, that tells the examiner that your interpretation of the data is actually wrong. The second thing they say here is in 2022, with the UK rising the most. Now, if we look at the data, did all countries increase between 2020 and 2022? No, if we look at Estonia, we can see Estonia actually decreased. And this often comes from students just getting lost in the data and being under time pressure. I know how stressful it can be to have to write a Task 1 report in 20 minutes or under, but you really need to get your overview correct. So when you write your overview, look at the data and double check everything for accuracy. Because again, it's one of the first things the examiners will check. And then they talk about the United Kingdom rising the most, and that's not really clear. And I wouldn't write something that is not 100% clear in the data. Because if we look at Sweden here, by percentage, it has a very similar growth rate compared to the United Kingdom. So again, that's just not accurate. Next sentence, it is also clear that all countries fluctuated significantly through the given period. Is that actually true? No. So 3 countries did fluctuate significantly, Latvia, Estonia, and Sweden. You can see that there are very large swings in their data. But if we look at the UK, Ireland, and France, there's not a huge amount of variation. So this student, when I worked with them, they were very frustrated because they were like, you told me to spot and write about key features. I'm writing about key features. Why is this not good? Well, just including lots of key features is not what the task is requiring you to do. It is requiring you to spot accurate key features and report them accurately. And then they've added at the end, Ireland was also the lowest. This is another common mistake that we see is people just writing things in general. It's too vague. What does that actually mean? The lowest of what? When? And similarly, Estonia was the highest. Again, a little bit too vague. And we need to think about why students make these mistakes. When I speak to students in the classroom and say, why did you do that? Why did you do this? They often say, well, I've been taught just to look for the biggest, the largest, the biggest increase, the smallest thing. And they just throw lots of darts at the dartboard and hopefully they hit something. That's not how you should approach this. It is much better to think about purpose. Why did the person create this data set? Think about it that way and then spot the key trends and the key features instead of just what's the biggest, what's the smallest. But don't worry if you're a little bit confused. We're going to show you exactly how to change it with a few simple changes and really improve this overview. Before we continue, what I've done is I've given you 100 Task 1 samples from our VIP students. These are all students that got a band 7, 8, or 9 in these samples and their real test. So I've put it all into one PDF for you. You can download it by going to the description, click the link, and you can download it right away. Very, very useful. And we'll talk about how to use these later on in the video. First, I want you to look at the bottom of this Task 1 report. Let's think about what a conclusion actually is. A conclusion is a summary of your main ideas or your opinion. In other words, what you think about something. But let's think about what you're doing in Task 1. Are you giving any of your own ideas? Are you giving your opinion in any way? Absolutely not. You're just reporting the raw data. None of your ideas, none of your opinions are in there. Task 2, you will have ideas, you will have opinions. And that's why you should have a conclusion, because it's a summary of your ideas and your opinion. In Task 1, we don't have that. So it's totally inappropriate to include a conclusion in Task 1. The next thing the examiner will be thinking about is looking at your data and thinking about, is this accurate or inaccurate? So let's think about how students can be inaccurate so we can avoid that. The first is the most obvious, reporting something that is just completely wrong. Like the date says 2021 and you write 2022. Now, mistakes can happen. We're all human and the examiners are not looking for perfection, but if you can minimize those obvious errors as much as possible, that's good. But the second way is actually much more common, and that's misinterpreting the data in the chart and guessing values. For example, let's look at the first details paragraph. To begin with the Scandinavian countries, Latvia began the period with 17%. So if we look at the actual data, it's not very clear that Latvia is actually 17%. It's kind of halfway between 15 and 20. Now, if you were being really generous, you say, 17, that's enough. It's pretty close. But that's not what's being tested here. It's being tested, can you accurately report data? So instead, what you could do is you could write around 17%, approximately 17%. Now, 2 little words, but it completely transforms the accuracy of what you've just reported. I've had many students who get frustrated with this and be like, but you know what I mean. Well, the examiner doesn't know what you mean. The examiner can't send you a text after or hopefully not, send you a message on WhatsApp and say, what did you actually mean? They can't do that. So you have to put on paper what is actually accurate. This type of stuff is important and it's very easy to fix. And if you look throughout this report, you'll see lots and lots of little mistakes like this. All of these are just guesses, but they're putting them on paper as if they are exact. So if we move on to coherence and cohesion, it talks a lot here about how you present the data or how you organize the data. So for band 6, it states arranges information and ideas coherently and there is a clear overall progression. If we compare that with what it says for band 7, it states logically organizes information and ideas. There is a clear progression throughout. So think about the difference between those two. There's a big difference between arranging something and logically organizing something. And if we move up to band 8, it states sequences information and ideas logically. So I don't think this language is actually helpful for most students. Most students find this very confusing. They don't know what it means. When we teach students about logic and organizing things in that way, most students don't get it. But the way that most students do get it is when I say this. Imagine someone in your life, like I would imagine my 11-year-old boy. How can I present the writing in a way that he will be able to read that and perfectly understand it? When we teach students that technique, many of them, it just clicks and go, oh, now I get it. That's easy. That's simple. Have a look at these two details paragraphs and have a think about what they've done. Well, the problem here is they've reported absolutely everything. That's important because it's not actually what the question is asking us to do. The question actually asks you to select key features and to write about those key features that you select. So think about that word select. The opposite of select is just writing about everything. Select means that you choose to write about certain things and you choose not to write about other things. And the other problem with that is you won't have enough time to finish not only task 1, but also you have to do task 2. Remember, you have 60 minutes, 40 minutes for task 2 and 20 minutes for task 1. If you're writing about everything, that's not only lowering your score for task 1, but it's probably going to lower your score for task 2 because you'll run out of time. And a little trick that we teach our students is to do task 2 first. Most students are far better at getting task 2 done on time than task 1 done on time. So we encourage students to do task 2 first, try and get everything done in under 40 minutes. And then what that does is it does something quite interesting. Because you only have 20 minutes at the end to do task 1, what it does is it kind of focuses your brain on the data. It forces you to select certain data instead of writing about everything. So the next thing we need to move on to is arranging our ideas logically. So how are we going to do that? So we need to look at the different countries and think about which countries could I group together in a way that would make sense. And again, think about that person in your life that you are writing to. How could you arrange and group those countries together in a way that would help them understand the data? So what this student has done is they've grouped the different countries together into Scandinavian countries and Western European countries. So there's two problems with this. Number one, the data is not comparing Scandinavian and Western European countries. That's not the purpose of the data. So again, this comes from students bringing in their own data from their own brain. They're looking at the data and they're thinking, okay, there's some Scandinavian countries here, there's some Western European countries in here, I understand what that means, let's put them together. That's not what the task is asking you to do. The other problem with that is, again, by bringing in your own information, often your own information is wrong. Latvia is not a Scandinavian country. Also, what they've done here is they've just looked at the key here and they've seen Latvia, Sweden, Estonia are the first three and France, United Kingdom, Ireland are the second three. So let's just organize it in that way. Again, that's not really accurate or appropriate. Remember, the marking criteria talks about arranging and organizing information logically. You know, when you say the word logic, students just look at you and go blank. A better way to think about logic is reason. So what is the reason why you are grouping countries together like that? So if you're like, oh, it's just the first three, well, that's not a good reason. But if we look at the data later and say like, oh, these countries have this in common and these countries have this in common, that's a reason That's logic to put them together. We'll look at that later in the video. The next thing the examiners will be thinking about is your use of cohesive devices. That's just a fancy way of saying linking words, or some people call them linkers. These are words like to begin with, overall, in conclusion, therefore, however. So for a band 6, it talks about faulty or mechanical use of these cohesive devices. Faulty means you're using them incorrectly. So maybe the meaning is wrong or the spelling is wrong. And mechanical, the biggest mistake that we see is students just inserting them everywhere. They think that the more cohesive devices or linking words they use, the higher their score. This isn't actually correct. So a good rule is to only use them when you absolutely think, I definitely should use it in this place, and only use the simple ones that you know how to use correctly. You know the meaning, you know the spelling. You don't get extra points for using high level or fancy cohesive devices. That's just not a thing. So if we look at this one, contrastingly, what the student is trying to do is they're trying to get extra points by using a very long, complicated cohesive device. And what they've done is they've completely messed it up. So if you have a look, what is the problem? Well, it's spelt incorrectly. It would be much easier to just write in contrast. Simpler, but accurate, more effective. The next thing examiners will think about is paragraphing. Now, this student did a pretty good job with paragraphing. There's clear space between each of the paragraphs. You can just look at it and clearly see where one paragraph ends and the next paragraph begins. If you're unsure about this, just skip a line between paragraphs. That makes it super clear to the examiner. So let's move on now to vocabulary. It's often referred to as lexical resource, just a fancy way of saying vocabulary. If we think about vocabulary in its simplest form, it's did you use the words accurately, correctly? Is the meaning correct? Is the spelling correct? So for example, we've already talked about kingdoms. This is not actually accurate. The meaning is different from what the student thinks it is. If they changed it to an accurate synonym, like states, for example, then it would be fine, because states and countries mean the same thing. Can you spot any other problems with vocabulary? Take a look. What about this word, adequate? It's a spelling mistake. Let's have a look at this paragraph. Can you spot any synonym problems here? How about this word, province? Again, similar to the problem with kingdoms, provinces, again, it's a synonym of countries, but it's not really an accurate synonym. And if an examiner looks at a typical band 5, band 6 response, they'll find these little errors in nearly every sentence. Nearly every sentence will have a spelling mistake. That's a vocabulary error, or a meaning mistake, or a synonym mistake. Very, very similar story when it comes to grammar for this student. It's not that they're making huge errors, but if an examiner looks at their report, nearly every sentence has at least one small grammatical error. Not massive errors that stop the examiner understanding what the student is trying to say, but just multiple small errors over and over again. So for example, the line chart illustrate should be illustrates. Overall, all kingdoms in the EU increase should be increased. That's a tense mistake because we're talking about the past. Witness should be past tense. Witnessed. If you look at the whole essay, you'll see these problems come up again and again and again. Nearly every sentence has those small errors in them. So if we look at the official marking criteria, you'll see the difference between band 6 and band 8. Band 6 says make some errors in grammar and punctuation, but they rarely reduce communication. This means that they happen again and again, but it doesn't really stop the examiner understanding. But the real key information is where it says in band 8, the majority of sentences are error-free. That means that they have no grammatical errors in them at all. And the majority, more than 50%, are like that. So when you add all of those things up, grammar, vocabulary, coherence and cohesion, task achievement, that makes it a band 6. And it's actually not bad. There are lots of little changes that we can make that can get this person to a band 7 or even a band 8. And that's what we're going to do now. So this is actually a pretty good introduction. It just has a lot of those little vocabulary and grammar issues. So we're just going to fix all of those. The line chart illustrates the proportion of adults who did not receive adequate health treatment between 2008 and 2022 in 6 countries in Europe. And you'll notice I repeated the word adults because I don't want to give you the wrong impression that you have to change every single word when you're paraphrasing your introduction, because that sends a message to students that they need to think of an accurate synonym before they move on. It's better to repeat the word and move on and get on with the rest of your report than spend 5 minutes going like, I can't think of another way to say adults. Like, it's okay to repeat some words. Try and vary your vocabulary as much as you can, but don't get stuck on one word. So before we help the student with their overview, I just want to look at the data again and think about what is really happening here. So we're looking for key features or the most important things or the most significant things. A little trick that I came up with a long time ago when I was teaching in the classroom was the journalist trick. Imagine you are a journalist and you have to write a headline about this data. So what that does is it forces you to only write the most important thing, because a headline, that's what a headline is in a newspaper. Try this trick with this data and see what you think. So looking at the data, I think one of the most significant things is between 2020 and 2022, with the exception of one country, all increased. So this is a real chart from the Financial Times, and that is probably the headline. All countries except one, Estonia, increased in 2022. And then if we zoom out, take a 30,000 foot view, what else can we see about the data? So if we look at Latvia, Sweden, and Estonia, we can see very large, wild fluctuations. So we probably should include that in our overview as well. But if we contrast those three countries with France, United Kingdom, and Ireland, between 2008 and, let's say, 2018, they were far steadier. They didn't fluctuate as much as the other three countries. So we have two techniques so far for writing an overview. Number one is purpose. Why did they write this? Second is the headline, the journalist technique. But the third thing is, what are the 2 or 3 things that are in the data that are significant? So you could only write about 2 or 3 things. So imagine the overview is like a mini report. Ignore the introduction, ignore the other details paragraphs. Imagine you're only writing an overview and you could only write about 2 or 3 things. What are the 2 or 3 things that you would say? And that should really help. And if you want to practice that, what I would recommend doing is get lots of questions like here, look at the data and just give yourself 2 minutes and write down the 3 or 4 most obvious things, or the headline or the purpose, and try and do it under time conditions. Now, I have given you more than 100 samples here in this PDF. If you want that with lots of questions and band 7, 8, and 9 responses, all you have to do is just click the link in the description or in the pinned comment and you can get all of these. Another thing that you could do is you could take these questions and you could cover up the overview and try and identify the key features and what you would write in the overview and then compare it with these ones. Now, these are all band 7, 8, and 9 samples. So what they have in the overview is generally correct. So that could be another thing that you could do. So we've changed it from overall all kingdoms in the EU increase in 2022 and just simplified it by saying overall, except for Estonia, all states increased in 2022. Again, we looked for the most significant data. All of them increased except for one. So we just stated that. And we're not going to put that the UK rises the most because it's not really clear whether that's the case. It looks pretty equal with Sweden, so we don't want to write anything that we're not sure about that's not accurate. So if we look at the trends over time, 3 countries had massive fluctuations. So let's put that in. Latvia, Sweden, and Estonia witnessed the largest fluctuations. And then the other 3 countries remained quite stable, so we're going to put that in. Whilst the remaining countries were relatively stable up to 2018. So we're not saying that they were exactly stable, like it wasn't a straight line. We're using the word relatively to show that we are comparing the 3 countries with the other 3 countries. Again, comparisons are very, very important in task 1. So if we look at, again, the purpose of the data, what is the purpose? The purpose is to show trends over time and to compare countries. If we look at our new overview, that's exactly what's in there. And then if we continue to look, we can see that a big point is the UK diverging from all the other countries in 2018. The UK saw the most dramatic increase from the lowest in 2012 to the highest in 2022. So if we think about this just practically, they went from the best in 2012 to the worst in 2022. That is very significant, so we should put that in our overview. And a key point is, if we have a look at the overview here, what can you see that is not here? Well, there's no data. We do not put data in our overview. We put data in our data paragraphs that we're going to write about next. Remember, the overview is talking about data overall, and the data paragraphs is where we go into detail. Another thing you can do with all of these samples that you can download is, if you are working with a partner or maybe you're a teacher in the classroom, is what you can do is cut out the data bit and cut out the overview. Give the overview to one student and give the data to another student, but don't let them see each other's work. The person with just the writing, just the overview, get them to draw the data. All right, generally. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should look generally like that. And the person with the data, get them to write the overview and then get them to compare and talk about why they chose to make those different decisions. A really good exercise you can do with each other in the classroom. The next thing we need to do after our overview is logically organize our details paragraphs. In other words, for this data, how to group the countries together. So it's good to have this structure of introduction, overview, and then two details paragraphs or two data paragraphs, because what it does is it forces you to think what groups are going to be here and what groups are going to be here. What information is logical here and what information is logical here. So it might obviously not be always countries, but there's normally two groups in a way that you can logically organize them. There's a reason to put them together. So if we look at Latvia, Sweden, and Estonia, these are the ones that have these wild fluctuations. And then France, Ireland, and United Kingdom, they stay relatively stable and then increase. So that is the reason to group those countries together. So we're going to take Latvia, Estonia, and Sweden, and we're going to write about those in our first details paragraph. And then we're going to take France, United Kingdom, and Ireland, and we're going to write about those in our second details paragraph. But please, please, please don't look at a line graph over time and think, let's look for the ones that fluctuate and look for the ones that don't. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. You need to look at each chart on its own and think about what is a logical way to group different things together. Again, if you want, what you can do is you can look at these, download these, and go through this as an exercise. Don't try and do the questions first. Try and just look at how to organize the data and then look at how did this student actually organize the data. So let's start off with Latvia, Sweden, and Estonia. So we started off, Latvia had the highest number in 2010 with just over 20%. Contrast that with the Band 6 student. Latvia began the period with 17% of people unable to receive the required care, and this increased to 21%. So the key differences here are the Band 8 student is selecting the key features to write about. They're not writing about everything. And the next difference is the difference between the accuracy of the data. The Band 6 student has stated exactly 21%, whereas the Band 8 student has said just over 20%. Another way to think about this is the Band 6 students, somebody can argue with them and say you are wrong, whereas nobody can say the Band 8 student is wrong. It is just over 20%. But it definitely is not exactly 21%. Latvia also had fluctuations, so let's write about that. However, this steadily decreased to below 10% in 2020. Now let's write about Estonia. Let's have a look at Estonia. What is the most relevant, the most striking thing about Estonia? So have a look. What do you think about Estonia? Well, it has the biggest fluctuations. So we simply just want to describe that. So Estonia had the wildest fluctuations with around 6% in 2010, a massive jump to 20% in 2012, before falling again to 10% in 2014. Now you'll notice the Band 6 student continues on and says, and then steadying out to between 15 and 13% between 2016 and 2022. The Band 8 student has decided not to continue because they don't think that that information is relevant. Remember that word, select. You know, if you had to only select a few things about that country to talk about, the most important things, what would you write about? So let's move on to Sweden, and I'm going to teach you a little technique that you can learn that will help you write in task 1 about data, and it's called chunking. And what it does is, instead of writing about every single little point, you chunk things together in groups, and that forces you to only talk about the most significant data. So we can divide Sweden into kind of 2 chunks, from 2008 to 2020 and then 2020 to 2022. So instead of talking about 2008, then 2010, then 2012, then 2014, 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, we can chunk it all together. So we can say in 2008 it was high, and then in 2020 it was low, so it just steadily decreased. And then it changed in 2020 and it increased in 2022. So you can see that we're not changing things massively. We're only making little small tweaks, but you can see the difference in the band scores is huge. So let's use chunking with the remaining 3 countries: France, United Kingdom, and Ireland. So chunk number 1 is kind of between 2008 and 2018. It's quite boring. It's just not much happening. It's just staying quite relatively flat. But this period, 2018 to 2022, things start to change dramatically for these 3 countries. So that's exactly what we want to write about. So France, the UK, and Ireland all started below 5% and remained relatively steady until 2018. So you'll notice here what we didn't do was say like France started at 5% and then talk about every year for France, and the UK started at below 5% and then every one for the UK. We want to group them together because we don't have time to be writing about every single little data point. And this is where chunking comes in again. So we're able to look at that chunk and think, well, they're all kind of below 5% at the start, and they all kind of remained relatively steady. So we can write that in. And a lot more happens in the second chunk, the second period. So the UK diverged from the other 2 in 2020. So they were all kind of doing the same thing, and then one diverged. It did something different, increasing dramatically to just under 10% in 2020, then above 15% in 2022, the highest of any country that year. So something very, very significant. So we want to mention that and detail that in the details paragraph. So if we simplify our task here for the details paragraph and think about the difference between band 6 and band 8, all we're really doing a bit better than the band 6 student is selecting the correct data and writing about it accurately and clearly. That's it. So that's why I said at the beginning of the video that it's nothing to do with English level or intelligence. That's not really the differentiator. It is just teaching students the correct strategies. And once you understand what to do, then it's much, much easier to get one of those higher scores. That's why, the students here, none of them were geniuses or had extremely high levels of English. They were able to produce these reports because we taught them on our VIP course step-by-step systems for exactly what to do. But in task 1, you might not just get data, you might also get a process. So if you want to see me transform a low-level process report into a higher one, click here.